I think I stumbled upon the holy grail of woodworking.
Imagine getting professional level results without needing expert level skill. Sounds impossible, right? Well, this video is for anyone that is interested in turning multiple objects with the exact same profile, regardless of your skill level.
If you're selling products like chess sets or other items that require consistency, this is a game changer. You want to replicate a three-dimensional object you already have? I'll show you how. With this jig, you really don't need skill to get started, just the right approach.
I'll explain exactly how this works in a second, but first let me tell you about a problem that I've had.
Wood turning has always fascinated me because it's so freeform, different from other types of woodworking. I usually throw a piece of wood on the lathe and let it guide me. But here's the problem. What happens when you need everything to be exactly the same when you're doing multiple objects? I tried making a chess set, and I failed so many times to create the small details perfectly. No matter how hard I tried, even using traditional tools and calipers, I couldn't get the consistency that I needed, and I wasted a lot of good wood in the process. And that's when I knew I needed a new approach, so I went on the journey to create my own jig. Something that would let me copy 3D objects with the same precision over and over again, whether I'm using a flat bandsaw template or a complex three-dimensional shape. I'll be honest, I failed multiple times on this before I figured it out, but once I got it right, the results were amazing. If you have experience or suggestions on how I can improve the process, I'm all ears. I'm open to learning and refining this technique, but let's dive in. I'll walk you through what I did, how this jig works, and hopefully give you the tools to start making exact replicas yourself. Thanks for watching. The very first step is to create a base plate. I have this leftover piece from a closet build out that I did that's basically like melamine. I cut a little groove in it with the router that fits on my banjo, and that really secures it pretty well. I also added these strips of 1/2-inch ply in the front and the back of my lathe so that I could index this base plate the same way every single time. This is critical later. I had a rough sketch, but really this jig is based around this cheap set of carbide tip tools. You can buy these on Amazon. The important part for me was that they were a square stock. This would come into play later, but essentially I started building out of scrap maple because it's very hard. I cut a notch in the top of this piece that would allow my carbide tip to sit at a 90-degree angle or a flat angle right at the center point of my lathe. That is where these carbide tips cut most effectively, and that will come into play in a second. But as I use my router to bring this down to size, what I'm thinking about is essentially just a secure fit. I have this extra piece that I was thinking about using, and to be honest, I don't end up following through with that design, so pay no attention to the second piece, but it slots in, and that's going to be the main piece at the front that holds my tool. The next step was to create a system that would allow me to adjust from this tool to my round cutting bit and also my square cutting bit, depending on what type of design I'm doing. So I cut at the table saw a groove that would match the same square stock. It turns out that not all three of these bits are exactly the same, so I needed to make a little bit more space, and I used the router and the table saw in conjunction to make that happen. And ultimately, after I cut everything down, I had a nice fit that would allow me to put any of the three tools in there. I then worked on a way to secure the tool down. The vibration and the force applied to this is actually substantial, but I used these scrap pieces of ply. I created a couple of holes that lined up with the middle and put in some threaded inserts. This would allow me to essentially use set screws to hold the tool down very securely. The plies come apart pretty easily if you just put the chisel right in the line. Not even critical, you're not even really gonna see it except for right there. But that's a mistake, I guess. But woodworking is fixing. At the end of the day, I have two very solid holding points sort of like set screws, and the overall groove is pretty tight to begin with, so it holds the tool very stable, and that's going to come into play when I use it. Vibration is my enemy, and I attached it now to the original piece that I cut, which holds it at the right height. I needed a way to hold it as well while using it. Something like a pistol grip would really be ideal, and I had a 2-inch dowel, which is a little bigger than I wanted, but whatever, scrap material. So I cut it down, and I drilled a Forstner bit hole into my material. Glue does not stick to this material, so giving myself a little bit of recess to fill up with glue, hold this pistol grip thing very securely was ideal. I didn't know how to measure it perfectly with, I didn't want to take the time, basically, so I inched up on the depth of cut here, and I got it to the point where the front edge of my jig was sitting flush to the top of that melamine piece, as you see there. Originally, it was a little too long. Then I screwed in a hole at the bottom. Now, this design ultimately changed pretty quickly because I realized, first of all, I blew out the hole, as you can see, and I was going to use a fixed point at the very bottom for my following bit. Then I realized if I just had a slot here, I could adjust it up and down. That would accommodate 2 different types of patterning, and honestly, it's just a better design. So I went back to the table saw and figured out a way to cut this thing. Now, I don't have a full shop set up yet. I only have this job site saw and a little palm router, and this is some hard maple, so I opted to clamp it, give myself some support, and take very small bites, raising the blade incrementally up to about 3 inches on either side of the line. Now, it's important that this matches up with my bit at the top. It needs to be centered on that, of course. So I took care to kind of be inside the lines, as you can see on my layout. I also left the part that was kind of chewed up by my threaded insert. Again, when I rebuild this jig, I will do it a lot more cleanly. And now you can see the adjustability that I have. This will accommodate up to like a 4-inch piece, and I could always drill a hole higher up if I need to. But basically, you're going to set the following bit right at the center point, 9 o'clock if you were looking at it sort of end to end. And that's where the outermost point of your piece is if it's a 3-dimensional object. And if you're talking about doing a flat piece, you can lower the bit all the way down, as you see here, and follow something that's made out of 3/4 material or even 1/8-inch material if you want to do that. I do have a tip about that, and I'll show you when I demo it. But for now, this was shaping up. In this case, I have my base plate sticking out. I basically arbitrarily drilled this hole so that I could glue it in, but I didn't account for where the front would land because I didn't know how to measure that accurately with the tools I had on hand. So I just left it long, which is a really great tactic. The reason I want this to be flush is because, as you can see, if it's not, the bolt will be impeded, and I won't be able to tighten that easily. If it hangs off the edge, it's a much better system. And the line that I have drawn on there is something to show what it will look like and where I can cut. So relative measuring happening here. Basically, that's the adjustability I want. And now I just take it to the chop saw and cut to my line. I'm leaving a little bit of material because I can always sand it down to be perfect. And I'm chopping off the front corners so that I can get into tighter spaces. I found a smaller dowel, which I can also use as secondary support. So that will be sort of my back handle. I threw some glue in the holes. This will greatly reinforce this joint. I double checked that everything was square because that's obviously important. And my following bit, which was ground out of a bolt off camera, is now a sharp point that will mirror the cutting edge of my detail carbide tool. As I bolt these things in and slide the carbide tool in there, the important thing to note is that they are in alignment, both up and down, which they are, and the stick out is the same. So I used a square to make sure that that was the case, with both tips touching my ruler here, or my square. And then I also locked these bits down to keep that position and double checked that the tip was in alignment with the center of my lathe. That's where the carbide tools cut the best. Then I moved on to holding my three-dimensional piece, which is harder than expected because I needed a way to hold it securely in place, and you are pushing against it. So if it moves, you're going to completely screw up your cut. I CA glued a 1/2-inch piece of plywood, and then I doubled up on that with CA glue, the old welding technique. Used some activator to cure it quickly, and then reinforced it with screws. Now that I had that, I can align it to the center line that I put on my base plate, which is in alignment with the center point of my lathe, of course. And lining this up was actually a challenge. First of all, the clamps were getting in the way, so I had to redo this a couple of times, and I added this bolt with threaded insert and ended up gluing that side as well, just to hold it. And that worked okay, but it wasn't my favorite part of this jig. I was able to adjust it, and then I realized hogging out all this material with the detailed finishing bit is ludicrous, so I swapped it with this circle insert, a little bit aggressively, but this would allow me to take away a lot of the waste very quickly, and then I can always switch back to the final bit for the final details. In this case, I'm making a candle holder. It's not that detailed, but I will do a chest piece in a second using a different method, and I'll show you the difference there. Fired up the lathe. I am intentionally only holding it with the chuck on the motor side of the lathe. I don't have my tailstock installed, and this was somewhat of a disaster. I threw this piece off the lathe or loosened it significantly, probably close to 10 or 15 times, which I'm not proud of, but I learned something, and that is carbide tools like to grab. You need a lot of secure sort of weight to make sure that the bit does not tip forward. As I inched my way into roughing it out, I switched back to my detail bit, kept all the other settings the same, and then was able to finalize it. Again, double checking that the tips are sticking out the same amount, and then I ended up roughing it. And every time you see me touch the chuck, it means I threw it off or I jostled it enough. And ultimately, I got it done. I didn't part it off at the top, which is my bad, but I scratched the hell out of this piece. You can see it both at the very bottom and sort of in the middle. I scratched it really badly because I allowed my bit to tip forward, which is where the piece wants to grab, and that cut deeper than intended. That's why there are those lines. I could save it by either using traditional tools or sanding the hell out of that, but just because this is a demo, I decided not to. So that was test one. I think it went okay, to say the least, but it gets a lot better. As I was doing this, I was thinking of ways to improve this jig. I know this is not the first jig ever created to do this, but this is my attempt at solving this problem. And what I realized quickly is with the square front, even though I clipped off the edges of the base plate, I was getting dangerously close to hitting or coming in contact with my chuck. And that's obviously not safe. That will lead to a very bad day. So I wanted to cut it down, but I had already glued it together. My only thought was to take it to the bandsaw and cut away at a sweeping angle so that I had a very narrow focus where the bit was, and then it became wider for the stability and support. I ended up doing this on my bandsaw, which is currently in my living room. It was smoking like crazy because it was a huge cut through a ton of hard maple. But, like I said, I persevered, and ultimately this was a great improvement that proved to be the right choice. Again, if I was to do this from the start, I would have designed this completely differently, and since this is a prototype, I will likely improve it. Next up was copying this chest piece. And now this has a lot more detail because of obviously all the chest piece detail is fine and needs precision to be accurate. Of course, the very first time I used too short of an original piece, so I couldn't get the little tip on the top of the head. And I decided to keep going and just see what I could make of this. I was upset with myself for not getting it to be the right length, but I did something, and then I tried again. And I ended up failing again because I stupidly mounted it backwards, not thinking about the bolt that was running right through the head of it. And as I got too close, it just flew off the lathe, basically. I am a simple man. You can see the detail, though. It was getting very close to what I wanted. I just made a few mistakes. And while looking at this bolt, it seems painfully obvious. I really want to always mount the base of the thing, so I reset it with a new piece of wood, and I screwed up again because this is the bishop, and it has the little nub at the top. And as I was coming in to get the end, it was unsupported, and it vibrated, and it broke the stupid tip off the top of the rook. So I decided to pivot to a different method. I mentioned that you could also template things by using a bandsaw template with a flat piece. Now this is more my style. My background is in graphic design, and I printed these chess pieces out with a center point on them, stuck them to a scrap piece of 1/8 inch ply, brought them to my bandsaw, and cut out one side. I left the paper on here, which was attached with Super 77 spray glue, so that you could see exactly what the bit is attempting to do. And as I notched it out, I realized I could just screw this down, which is great. I had to clean up a little bit of my cuts, to be fair. And I wouldn't use this wood in the future. This is about the lowest grade plywood you could get. You can see that I've adjusted for the height, and I am able to make this piece generally without incident for the first one. But that's where the problems arise with this method. The primary issue here is that this very cheap plywood that I chose to use for my template actually was degrading as I used it more and more, especially around, I guess, the pawn's head. Is that even a head? That little ring below the spherical part was very fragile in the cheap plywood that I used, and the subsequent pawns are very close, but not exactly, because I kind of chipped away part of it. It was very fragile, like I said. So I decided to make a couple more of these just to prove that I could repeat this. And fair warning here, I'm using poplar, which is not the best wood, but it was something that I already had dowels of and could really quickly test the jig. So in a perfect world, you would be using hardwood. I will be making a full set using this jig in an upcoming video, so if you want to check that out, go ahead and subscribe. I am very much into creating jigs and using them for various processes and documenting this exploration. So on to the next one. I made another pawn with the same jig and template, and then I flipped it around and made a third. And I just parted these off, cut off the bases on the bandsaw, and you can see they're pretty close. I don't think you'd notice a difference if you were playing with them, but they're not perfect. So I went one more test. I wanted to use the same method using thicker plywood so that I didn't have the degradation problem. And I'm making these candle holders for my wedding, actually. So finessing the line and doing all this prep work was important. I wanted to have pairs. I even let the future wifey get on the bandsaw and try it, because why not? And she did a great job. We are both makers, and we live an insane life. And if you want to see what we're going to do with our dream shop, we are currently framing it, and it's going to be great. But back to this. So I took it back to the lathe. I'm cutting into oak this time. These are real pieces that I'm going to use. And so I took my time and I duplicated the same exact piece twice. And I'm parting it off in the middle so that I can finish it a little bit. I put a base coat, and then I'm using India ink to turn this black. This oak has a weird green and brown color that's not that attractive, and ebonizing it in this case makes for a very attractive, nice looking piece. And as you can see, they're the same. I finished this, and I'm going to have to drill the holes for the candles off camera. Normally I use the lathe to do that, but I just ran out of time on this one. Hey, I appreciate you watching. If you found this video helpful, inspiring, anything, giving it a thumbs up tells YouTube that you liked it. Sharing it with a friend really helps me out. And if you have any questions or suggestions, put them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you and grow this community, because I think this could be a great place for all of us to level up our skills together. If you want to stay in the loop on future builds, this is the place. My name is Nick, and this is Design is Blank. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.